And for more on President Xi's trip to Panama, we spoke to Juan Carlos Hidalgo. He's the policy analyst on Latin America at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity.
Well, these are two countries that are just establishing diplomatic relations. So I think that everything is pretty usual, pretty normal. You have agreements on trade, you have agreements on tourism, you have agreements on banking, extradition. I don't see anything that stands out as particularly surprising or worrying regarding these agreements.
You know, both countries established diplomatic relations last year, and since then we've seen a lot of progress. President Xi said in a speech that their history actually goes back 160 years, back to the Panama Canal, and now we see him touring that canal. China now the second largest user of the canal. Is this just the beginning?
Well, that's a good point. Many people think that China's engagement with Latin America is pretty recent, but we can go over 100 years, and there was a lot of Chinese immigrants that came to Central America and were involved in infrastructure, building infrastructure projects, building railroads to the Atlantic and so on. So I think this is positive. Many people regard China's engagement in Latin America as a zero-sum game, something that should concern Washington or something that will affect the relationship between these countries and the United States. I don't think that's the case. I think that Panama is up to benefit from engaging China. Of course, there are some areas where there should be particularly concern. I'm talking about the lack of transparency that might be involved when it comes to building infrastructure projects. That was one of the key points of these negotiations to have diplomatic relations. But overall, I think that Panama stands out to benefit from establishing diplomatic relations with China.
China is investing in a lot of infrastructure, ports, highways. Panama is actually the first Latin American country to sign a memorandum of understanding to promote the Belt and Road Initiative. So what is the win-win for both of these countries here?
Well, Panama is a country whose economy has grown the most in Latin America in the last decade. A lot of that has been spurred by investment in infrastructure. Now, they've had some problems with that. Panama is one of the countries where Odebrecht, the Brazilian firm involved in the Lava Jato scandal, paid the most bribes in Latin America. So there is concern that building infrastructure, or even infrastructure that might not be needed, is a way in order for government officials to enrich themselves. So I think it's very particularly important when it comes to this relationship between China and Panama, that all the contracts be made public and that there is the utmost transparency regarding procurement processes and the construction of infrastructure.
Both countries have been working toward a free trade agreement. How significant is that given the current global trade climate? And what would that mean?
Well, this is something usual. China usually negotiates free trade agreements with the countries it has, particularly small ones that have engaged in diplomatic relations. It did so with Costa Rica 10 years ago, right after Costa Rica recognized China as a diplomatic partner. I think it's positive for Panama to open up the Chinese market. We're talking 1.3 billion people. And I think that is a good signal for the region that people still believe in freer trade. Hopefully, that will be the case regarding this free trade agreement.
And what do you think the biggest takeaway from this visit to Panama is?
I think we need to emphasize the message that China's engagement in the region is not a zero-sum game. It doesn't represent a threat to other countries, particularly the United States. I know that there was some concerns in Washington, particularly when it comes to Panama. Let's remember that the canal zone was built by the United States, belonged to the United States for many decades, and the United States didn't see with good eyes, didn't see in a positive light the fact that Panama exerted its right to engage in diplomatic relations with China. I think that it should be emphasized that countries are within their rights to establish diplomatic relations with whomever they want, and also that this is not a zero-sum game.